Hi and welcome. Notching and cranking are two terms part of the vocabulary of most of us virtual military flight sim players. They refer to concepts that are both similar and drastically different at the same time. In their simplicity, they leave room for a number of questions, some of which I will try to answer today using both the gaming approach, plus discussions with active and former pilots and crews. Let's start by defining the two terms. So crank plus direction is a maneuver in the direction indicated and implies illuminating the target at or near gimbal limits. Notch or notching plus direction means that the aircraft is in a defensive position, and maneuver or maneuvering with reference to the threat. Simply put, cranking is a maneuver that primarily affects geometry. Notching aims to affect the hostile aircraft's radar by having the fighter hiding in the same filter that prevents ground clutter from being displayed in a pulse Doppler radar. Now let's move on and discuss some of the commonalities. First, the geometry manipulation, and second, the effects on V sub C, so the closure rate, which is slowing down. From a broad perspective, cranking and notching serve a similar purpose, manipulating geometry to achieve an advantage and a specific goal. Both in fact consist in a turn in the direction, such as the angles increase, and the closure rate V sub C decreases. The so-called cutaway if you are familiar with basic geometry. The cutaway has a number of direct consequences. The most important in the discussion are related to the aspect and V sub C. Our aspect, in fact, from the hostile's perspective, increases instantaneously. Moreover, the closure rate V sub C decreases. This effect is the most desirable, as it allows the fighter to conserve room and slow down the rate at which separation decreases. Through some simple maths, let's see how we can exacerbate our impact on V sub C. The first example sees the fighter flying at 600 knots due north, and the target 550 straight south. Geometry is true on, so 0 TA, 0 TA. Assuming co-alt to simplify the maths, we have that V sub C is equal to the sum of the speeds, ergo 1150 knots. This is our reference value. The example 2 shows the effects of cranking to ATA 60 right. Closure rate drops by a considerable amount from 150 knots to 850 knots, 26% lower than the reference value. So, here is a common question. What if our fighter slows down? Is it worth it? Discussing this point with active and former crews, and keeping in mind that actual real tactics are strictly no-no, their point is rather simple. Speed is important. Simple as that. What they probably did entail is that being a slow-moving airplane makes our fighter an easier target. It cuts the options and requires a higher investment of resources, so altitude and or fuel, to regain speed. However, there are occasions where slowing down may have sense. For example, if you are dashing past the transonic speed for the employment and fuel is a concern, slowing down can increase endurance. Another example is a vastly asymmetrical engagement. For example, a mid-80s fight between a Tomcat armed with the M54s against most threats allows the Tomcat to engage farther and before anyone else, although it may not always be the best course of action. In this case, after the first launch at Mach 1, the Tomcat can slow down to Mach 0.7 or Mach 0.8, reducing V sub C and saving fuel, whilst maintaining sufficient speed to quickly react to any threat. Example 3 shows, at an altitude of about 25,000 feet, the effects of slowing down from Mach 1 to Mach 0.8. As we can clearly see, the difference is really minimal. What if we really want to pull the brakes and slow down from Mach 0.1 to Mach 0.6? Example 4 shows the results, and again we see a really minimal effect, and the necessity of accelerating again for a follow-up shot questions the validity of such an action. In fact, nailing the angles has a vastly more tangible outcome. Cranking from 60 right to 65 right, which is probably not possible for many radars, but here we are exquisitely discussing maths, results in a V sub C decrease of 30%, fundamentally the same effect of slowing down as shown in example 5. If you're not new to these pages, you may remember how, although low TA is desirable, a slight offset is always recommended. Example 6 shows the effects of cranking from 15 degrees off 60 right. The outcome is minimal and has possibly greater negative effects on the missile performance, especially if launched off lead collision or without considering the ASE. Another point sometimes mentioned that draws different conclusions is how hard the crank should be performed. This is mostly related to the capabilities of your aircraft, which in DCS means how accurate is the representation in the game. Fighters such as the F-14 Tomcat can result in a missile wasted if the turn is too hard and more than one target is present. The problem is the combination of INS, WCS, and the usage of track scan. Simply put, tracks are refreshed every 2 seconds. If the turn-drift ratio is too high, the avionics cannot discern which track is which, with undesired consequences. So, the answer to the question is AR turn works as long as you're not flying the F-14 Tomcat and employing Intuiz. Before moving forward, a curiosity about cranking. Changing speed, especially accelerated, can help to defeat a potential incoming missile. As the fighter accelerates, in fact, the missile has to correct more and more to catch up with the aircraft. The impact is minimal, especially at high altitude and against more nimble missiles, but is always a good to know fact. What about notching? Well, notching is a particular case because it wants a specific set of angles. When notching, the closure rate is always equal to the target's closure component, as the fighter's closure component is always 0, or close to 0. Example 7 shows the fighter notching the hostile aeroplane 0TA 9080A. V sub c equals the speed of the hostile target. Example 8 instead shows the fighter notching whilst being 45 degrees off, but again, still notching. And V sub c does not match the speed of the hostile aircraft anymore. Let's now discuss some of the differences. There are several. Here I have listed only 3. In premise, when cranking, we do not care about our target aspect too much. As we've seen, the greater the ATA, the better, as V sub c is tangibly reduced. However, if we crank 55 degrees or 57 degrees, it matters relatively. When notching instead, we aim to be as close to the perpendicular to the radar beam vector as possible. Although notching an ancient radar such as the Hawk-9 does not require nailing 90 degrees perfectly, because its interval is huge, is plus minus 133 knots, more modern radars have much narrower intervals, and against them we want to be as close to 90 degrees as possible. Another difference is the posture. Cranking is often an offensive maneuver, typically associated with missile employment, as the idea is staying out of the hostile wedge while supporting our missile. Notching instead is usually a defensive maneuver used to break a lock, rather than defeating a missile or to gain a tactical advantage. For example, by notching, we can change altitude and escape the hostile aircraft's radar and decrease its SA. In DCS, notching is abused and defeating missiles using it is far too simple. A split second in the notch and the missile is trashed. Hopefully this aspect will be improved by ED in the near future. Lastly, cranking should maintain radar awareness, and a specific brevity gimbal can be used when a wingman is about to lose radar awareness or missile support whilst cranking with a leader. Notching instead places the target on the 3-9 o'clock line and outside the radar's gimbal limits. Before wrapping this up, let's go a bit deeper into the topic of notching. In particular, I had a chat with an F-18 pilot, a Tornado F-3 nav, and an F-14A radar intercept officer, and I asked them what they thought about the maneuver when it comes to DCS. Note that all of them were active in the 80s and the 90s. The Hornet pilot suggested to always introduce some sort of negative vertical displacement. This does not mean hitting the deck, but rather introducing clutter into a situation already not simple to manage for the radar operator. The Tornado F-3 nav highlighted that pulse Doppler radars are not affected when looking down, but a degree of vertical displacement still carries some positive effects. For example, it makes the requisition harder, as the radar operator has to guess both azimuth and elevation when the target is maneuvering. Moreover, descending allows the fighter to regain energy lost in a break. Finally, I discussed the points above with the foreman Taucan Rio. He agreed that notching and vertical displacement bring benefits in terms of clutter, positional change, and or gaining an advantage, and energy acquisition. However, he also highlighted how the ALR 4550 was quite weak, so they notch preemptively based on the range and the anticipated threats envelope. The last point to mention about notching is the misconception when it comes to notching an aircraft versus notching a missile. Semi-active radar homing missiles require continuous guidance until timeout, whereas active radar homing missiles are either activated or self-activate at a certain point of their journey towards the target. The trajectories of missiles and aircraft are almost always different and do not overlap, which leads to the question of what radar should be notched. The answer is quite simple. For semi-active radar missiles, you should focus on the aircraft illuminating your fighter. For active radar homing missiles, it depends on whether the missile seeker is active or not. Until activation, you should aim to notch the launching aircraft, otherwise the missile. The difficulty lies in understanding the correct angles to notch, especially if you are flying with one of the better implemented RWRs such as the Tomcats. And that's all for this video. I hope you found it useful. Thanks for watching and take care.